Brookline is in a situation where we have what's called a structural deficit. And a structural deficit, for people who aren't aware, is a persistent longer term budget imbalance that occurs sometimes where your expenses exceed your revenue over a longer period of time. It's not just kind of a 1 year deficit where you resolve it and then you're sort of back to a set of balanced books in subsequent years. And this exists not just on the town side, but also on the school side. So it's sort of a, broader town level issue. Really, the driver here is that property tax revenues in Brookline account for about 80% of the overall operating revenue that we take in. And those can only be increased by 2.5% due to Proposition 2.5, which many people are familiar with. So that is a Massachusetts law that caps the increase of the tax levy on an annual basis. Other revenue sources are things like local receipts, so parking fines, the hotel room tax, and some level of state aid that we get. Those tend to be a little bit harder to forecast, and they've been relatively flat in recent years. Um, Over the last number of years, what you typically see is that when you adjust for inflation, the actual growth of revenues is only about 1.5%, right? So costs are growing, and revenues are sort of not, keeping pace in the same way. Expenses, on the other hand, are the growth of expenses is not restricted in the same way that Proposition 2.5 restricts the taxes that you can levy. So this includes everything from unfunded mandates from town meeting, collectively bargained contracts, and then all sorts of other, challenges that all communities in Massachusetts are facing. So inflation, rising cost of healthcare premiums, pensions and healthcare liabilities for retired individuals that we have an obligation to fund. So when you take a look at the overall budget situation and the structural deficit, what we see is that there's a significant increase in the expenses, and that basically eats away at almost entirely what the Proposition 2.5 increase allows you to generate incrementally year over year. So as a result, a lot of communities in Massachusetts are actually putting overrides on the ballot, or they actually end up having to make significant cuts. So, for example, in fiscal 26, what you saw was that there were 54 communities that actually put overrides on the ballot, and they put something like 70 something overrides on the ballot, because some put multiple on their ballots. And just as a point of comparison, in fiscal 17, that number was 21, right? So this is sort of a growing challenge for communities in Massachusetts. And sort of the salient point here is that Brookline is not alone. When people ask about, why is there limited revenue, or why is the revenue that's allocated to the town or the schools sort of flat year over year, the reason is because there's a series of shared expenses. So that includes things like benefits, and debt service. The increase in revenues that we get is basically taken up by those items that are shared services, largely driven by the benefits component of that line item. So then what's left over to be split between the town and the schools is really flat year over year for the next several years. So that's the situation that we're in. Again, Brookline is not alone in this situation. Many communities in Massachusetts are dealing with the same challenge.
So we are looking at the an 11% rise in our property taxes over the next 3 years. And that is based on what is already built in for our tax increases from prior debt exclusions and from the annual 2.5% levy. So specifically, even without an override, for FY27, we would be going up a shade over 5%. For FY28, 3.14%. For FY29, 3.1%. In terms of what that looks like for the median single family home, that's about an increase of $2,463 over the next 3 years. For the median value condominium, that is an increase of $1,441 over the next 3 years. That averages to about $820 a year for a single family home and $480 a year for a condominium. Now, if the override passes, as we hope it does, then the total increase over the next 3 years would be about 18%, but the override portion of that would be approximately 7%. And what those numbers look like for FY27, the increase would be 2.96%, or about $9.9 million. For FY28, it would be 1.68%, or approximately $5.6 million. For FY29, it would be 2.35%, approximately $7.8 million. For the median single family home, that would be an additional $3,924 over the 3 year period. For the median condominium, it would be an increase of about $200,296 over the 3 years. In terms of an average, that would be $1,308 a year for the median single family home and $765 a year for a condominium. Another way of looking at this is that on a monthly basis, for every $1 million assessed, you have about a $20 increase per month.
I've known Superintendent Wong for a while, for many years actually. She actually came here at a leadership seminar that I sponsored with the Brookline Parent Organization and Boston University at the formerly the Devotion School, and she was one of the presenters. And again, I knew her well, and one of the things I knew very well about Bella, who, by the way, everybody graduated from Brookline High School in 1978. Go Bella Wong. She was state track star. She loves Brookline, and she's really excited to be back here. But what I'm saying is that, for example, she was an interim superintendent in Natick a few years ago. And during that year, she prepared that, in 1 year, without knowing the community well, she prepared that community for a vote to override Proposition 2.5 in Natick. And she stayed for 1 year. The vote was in the fall and it passed, which is an example of her proven ability to manage the finances of a school system. So when she agreed to come here and then agreed to stay here, um, I can really reassure the community that after a bunch of years of less than spectacular financial management in the system, we now have Superintendent Bella Wong, who is a master at school finance, and she's quickly achieved the respect um, of town leaders, including Chaz, and school leaders, including all the principals. They are thrilled to have Bella Wong to be their leader, and so that's a super game changer. And I think we're on the threshold of something really great over the next few years, including the most important component of this, which is to manage the financial crisis that we continue to have.
During my tenure on school committee, we looked at where we could cut non-student facing positions. Many cuts were made to central office, including the entire Office of Strategy and Performance, which had 4 to 6 people in it at various times, and even a deputy superintendent. More controversially, of course, world language instruction from grades K through 6 was eliminated. Heath, now Hayes, was intentionally put on a trajectory to become more of a two-section school, meaning 2 classes per grade level, in order to try to open up enough classrooms for additional special education programming. That was in an effort to reduce out-of-district special education placements where appropriate. There were also reductions made in computer leases. There was a scaling back on professional development. There were adjustments to bus routing and transportation models to try to improve efficiencies in those areas. Since coming over to Select Board, on the town side, there have been 5 full-time equivalent positions that were eliminated across departments, and those responsibilities shared among remaining personnel. There have been enterprise fund and user pay programs that have been implemented, including pay as you throw, solid waste system. There have been fee increases, such as for building permits, parking violation fines, Ben, and other municipal service charges. This has netted about $2 million in recurring savings per year. There's been some scaling back on capital spending, But of course, that carries some risks because if you don't maintain your buildings on the right schedule, that can lead to larger costs down the road. But occasionally, with tight budgets, that's necessary. There have been some increased efficiencies within certain departments. I mentioned earlier the legal department having done that in an effort to avoid duplication of administrative services and too much outsourcing. There have been ongoing reviews of public safety staffing models, management of overtime, revenue diversification efforts around local meals tax and other local receipts, and pursuit of commercial and mixed growth opportunities, such as Chestnut Hill West rezoning, which will be voted on by town meeting in May. Similarly, on the town side, we have very stable leadership. The finance department has had many of the same senior personnel for a significant period of time, such as Melissa Goff. Chaz Carey has now been town administrator for a few years, and he recently had his contract extended. These are very thoughtful, prudent people who really try to maximize efficiencies, work together with their partners on the school side to achieve the best results with limited dollars. And so I think we have the right teams in place on both the school side and the town side to have more financially sustainable trajectories moving forward.
I mentioned before that there's sort of a set of shared services, and when you get revenue in, those shared services are paid for first. And then the remaining is actually split between the town and the schools, and that's split roughly 40% to the town and 60% to the schools, roughly. There's some, sort of iteration of that by, allocations or chargebacks over the course of the year. But that's kind of the high level formula. And what we've seen and are seeing over the next several years is that those shared services are basically taking up the incremental revenue that we expect to raise over the next 3 years. As a result, there is less to split among the town and the schools. So people will often talk about, the schools and, what their allocation is, which is essentially flat year over year for the next 3 years, flat to slightly down. But the town has a similar problem, right? So with those shared services, primarily driven by healthcare and sort of other rising costs, taking up the incremental revenue that's raised, you have to sort of deal with a flat revenue situation year over year, flat allocation. So the school override number is just shy of 18 million, and the town is 5.3 million. The school budget driver is really salaries, which makes up about 87% of the budget. And if you think about that, there really is a result isn't a lot of other stuff left to cut, right? So it really is when you start to make cuts in, a failed override situation, which we hope not to be in, it really ends up impacting headcount within the school system. The school budget is growing, by a little bit less than 5% in fiscal 27. Almost $2 million of that is actually driven by some of the circuit breaker funding that was used to close the gap in fiscal 27, fiscal 26, if people remember that. Then it's a little shy of 4%, around 5%. So typically somewhere in the 4% range, which is actually typical of the growth in past years as well. The gap is really that the allocation is flat year over year because of that growing cost of the shared services. So I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, that, there isn't sort of, a whole bunch of nice to haves that are being added, or, extra spending that's sort of coming out of nowhere. This is really, sort of a situation of rising costs that a lot of communities are contending with.
I think that I think that folks need to understand that even with this rather robust override, and thank you, Select Board, for making that decision, because obviously we're all aware of the magnitude of the cuts that would be necessary with no override. But I think that I think that there are still going to be 22 positions eliminated from the schools, including librarians, technology people, some administration. Even with the override, you still lose 22 positions. And you also lose about $1.5 million from the town side as well. So people have to understand that, this, it is a robust override. It's 23.25 million bucks. Um, and the select board could have made other decisions about the nature of the override, but with a lower number, it would have meant additional serious cuts. And the end without the override, we're talking about getting rid of the conservatory music program in the middle schools, talking about getting rid of world language in the middle schools. We're talking about class sizes in many schools, 35, 36. So it is clear that without an override and without a robust override, um, the this Brookline would be in crisis. And I've said this many times, Brookline would not look like Brookline because people move here for those very services, for great schools, for great public safety, for great public services. And without a robust override, that would be dramatically changed and that would be disturbing. So even if there was a lower number for the override, we would still have to cut significantly more than we're going to do anyway, even with the robust override. So it's that's just the way it is. And the amount of money that each of us would pay with a lower override really is not that much of a difference. And so I strongly hope that the community comes out strongly in favor of this robust override to really preserve the existential character of our community.
So, I mentioned that the town, the schools made a really good faith effort to make cuts that were straightforward. And then there are longer term opportunities, right? Those longer term opportunities just take longer fundamentally, or they're more complex to implement. And there were recommendations related to that within the E&R report. People can, read those in greater detail if they want. But some of the highlights were, the first one was really that I think is worth mentioning is economic development. So continuing to invest in economic development, commercial real estate development specifically. There is a large portion of our tax base, the majority of our tax base is residential real estate. Commercial real estate adds to that tax base and alleviates the pressure on residential taxpayers when you have additional commercial real estate revenue, right? So this is an important thing for us to consider, as well as other revenue opportunities across town. There's smaller revenue opportunities that we had recommended. So looking at additional rental income from recreational facilities, right? So really thinking about launching a pilot to actually streamline how our school facilities and other facilities are rented to make sure that we're maximizing the revenue that could come from that. And taking a hard look at other facilities rentals that we have or that we're doing to make sure that they're paying market rate. Taking a look at BEAT financials to make sure that that's breaking even. And then there were a series of cost savings opportunities as well. And a number of these, as well as a couple of the ones that I mentioned around facilities rentals, as well as BEAT revenue, were actually proposed as part of a memorandum of understanding that actually the town and the schools have drafted, and I think should be finalized any minute now. And it's basically a commitment to actually take a look at these longer term opportunities. And the specific ones around cost include the town and the schools partnering to negotiate reduced healthcare premium contributions on the part of the town for town and school employees, and to make sure that that contribution is more similar to comparable communities. Because right now ours is higher than other comparable communities. The reason this is in more of the long-term structures, this requires renegotiation with a number of different unions, somewhere between five and nine. I know of five, but I was told that there are more. So it's a non-trivial undertaking. It's complex, and it's not something that happens overnight, and certainly not something that's going to happen before May 5th. Right, so that's a longer term undertaking, but potentially cost savings. We ask that the schools take a look at wage expenses and try to bring those in line with sort of projected year over year revenue increases. Also considering balancing that we have to make sure that this is a place that teachers want to work, right? So that's obviously a critical component. You have to be able to hire and retain talented teachers. Also taking a look at the school model was something where we thought that there was potentially some cost savings. And there was a series of other recommendations that we made that were included in the memorandum of understanding. There were a couple of other things on the energy side, so some investment in solar that the town is pursuing that will actually save approximately 400,000 a year in energy costs once that's fully online, as well as taking a look at electrical demand management. Some really good nuggets in there for people who are interested in reading all of the details. But lots of interesting ideas in there, and I thought I was really happy to see both the town and the schools agree to actually undertake that memorandum of understanding and agree to commit to actually taking a look at these longer term cost structure opportunities, so that over time, the goal is to help manage both the size and the frequency of overrides in the future.
So we've been working on the comprehensive plan that's been shared by Paul Warren. And part of the goal of that is what is the Brookline that we envision for the future? What are the best uses for certain neighborhoods and different locations in town? What are some economic growth opportunities that might be available to us so that we can expand the proverbial pie in terms of bringing in more revenue through new growth? I referenced Chestnut Hill West earlier. There will be other projects down the line that get explored. Select Board is very committed to trying to become less dependent on residential taxpayers. And so that's an ongoing process. But again, as Sadaf mentioned, it doesn't happen overnight. And so that's why overrides become a necessary stopgap to try to bridge us to a time when hopefully we will have more revenue coming in. To put into perspective what one significant project can accomplish, the Chestnut Hill West project is estimated to bring in between 5 and 7 million a year in net new revenue. If we had that already up and running right now, we possibly wouldn't be having an override on the ballot this year because that would cover the entire ask of the schools. So economic growth does matter a lot. Select Board and town staff are very well aware of it, and we're committed to easing the residential tax burden. So there's the potential impact on our bond rating. A failed override could have significant financial consequences beyond the service cuts that you just referenced, Ben. It could include pressure on our town's credit rating, also known as bond rating. This matters because the bond rating affects how much the town pays to borrow money for major projects like school constructions, road maintenance, general infrastructure. Brookline currently holds a AAA municipal bond rating that is the highest possible credit rating. Only 15 of the 351 municipalities in Massachusetts have a AAA municipal bond rating. So again, Brookline is already near the top there, and that is based on our financial practices. A AAA rating signals that a town has strong financial management, that it has stable revenues and reserves, that lenders view it as extremely low risk to lend to, and this allows Brookline to borrow money at significantly lower interest rates. On a large capital project of, say, $200 to $300 million, even a modest rating downgrade that led to a 0.25 to 0.5% higher interest rate would cost millions of dollars in additional interest payments over the life of the bonds. That means more tax dollars going to debt payments rather than to services and what the money was designed to produce as a town amenity. Another area that can be impacted by a failed override is the desirability to live in a community. So property values tend to be perceived as higher when you're in a community that has a high quality of life, that supports a robust, high quality public school system, that has public safety with fully staffed fire departments, fully staffed police departments, that have many officers available for patrol or investigations and firefighters who can help improve response times in emergency scenarios. People want to live in communities like that, and currently Brookline offers those types of amenities, and we would stand to potentially lose some of them if this override doesn't pass. There would be less infrastructure maintenance, reduced recreational opportunities, reduced library programming, fewer community initiatives such as the senior shuttle. So there are a lot of implications that go beyond some of the services we were talking about within the schools and within the town.
People sometimes are cynical, skeptical about politics and politicians, but having been a public servant basically all my life, I have come to a definition of politics that I think is a high level sense of what politics is all about. And politics is the way a community decides to live together. Politics is the way we decide what kind of community we want to live in. And so here we are um, in a political environment where we're making a decision about overriding Proposition 2.5. So to me, that's really um, it's an idealistic environment to live in. A democracy, which obviously is threatened all over the place. Although, congratulations to the guy who beat Orban yesterday. Good job. Pro-democracy in Hungary. Let's hopefully that happens in our country soon as well. But anyway, so um, I just love politics because it's an exchange of ideas. Um, it's a way to decide what this community needs. And I think we should celebrate the fact that we're having these conversations. I think we should celebrate the fact that the Select Board, a democratic institution, has decided to ask us to be generous to support the community. You know, that's to me, that's the bottom line. That we've had the discussions. Sadaf has been part of them. David has been part of the conversations. We've all been part of them formally and informally. And we've decided to have a vote on May 5th about the way we want to live together in this community. And it means spending a little bit more money from our pockets. So maybe we can cut back on some dinners over the course of a year or cut back on some expenses that maybe are a little bit more frivolous in order to celebrate our democracy and in order to celebrate the services that we receive by living in this community. So that's my response to, why the override? Because the override is all about us figuring out together, ultimately voting the kind of services that we want for each other, for our kids, for our seniors, for our safety, for our education. So vote yes, May 5th for Brookline. Keep Brookline, Brookline.